We're talking about three things today, the most important of which is the third one, when I'm talking about the guaranteed famine that the world's going to be experiencing. First, a couple other items. Let's get right into it. We're going to go fast. This is just a fun one. It was an article from CNBC, and it was a chart of back-to-school inflation. How is inflation hitting you and your kids when you're buying them supplies to go back to school? So here's a chart showing you what's gone up the most in price. And you can see the big gainer is 29% for paper. The price of paper has gone up 29%. But most of that gain was actually from 2022 until now. So in a year and a half, it's gone up about 25%. We got the recent jobs report for non-farm payrolls. The Dow Jones estimate was for 200,000 new jobs to be created, and we only got 187,000, so not much of a miss, but still a miss. When the job numbers miss or they're weak, the weaker they are, the more that gets welcomed by the market. Because if the jobs start lowering, the employment picture gets a little bit weaker, the Federal Reserve may not have to be so aggressive with the rate hiking campaign. They might not have to keep rates that high for that long. The unemployment rate is only 3.5%. Part of the problem with why the Federal Reserve is being so aggressive, they're trying to break up the strong employment market to a certain degree. It's going to help fight against inflation. But the unemployment rate's only 3.5%, incredibly low. I always tell you, anytime it gets below 4%, that starts putting a strain on all small businesses. And the lower it goes, the harder it is to find or attract good talent, to keep the talent you have. It's a job seekers market, not an employer's market. A bright spot in all this, the average hourly earnings increased by 0.4% for the month and 4.4% annualized. So most people on average are making about 4.4% more per hour than they did a year ago. And of the 187,000 new jobs created, most of those were in healthcare, financing activities, social assistance, and wholesale trade, which is a bit different than when I tell you that you see a strong employment number and it's all hospitality workers or temporary workers, bartenders, baristas. Like when we had the big opening trade and everybody went back out to go to Starbucks. I don't put as much stake into those kinds of job numbers, but these job numbers were a little bit more strong based on some of the jobs that were being created, even though the numbers still missed the Dow Jones estimate by about 13,000 jobs. As the job numbers get weaker, whenever we get to that point, because we're not there yet, a lot of these interest rate hikes have a delayed effect and they'll start affecting a lot of companies right now. But with the weaker that the job picture gets, the more that's going to be cheered by investors because they don't expect the Federal Reserve to be so aggressive with their interest rate hikes. And when interest rates go up, that's usually good for the dollar. When they go down, that's usually bad for the dollar. So what's going to happen is the US dollar will lose a lot of its comparative value, making everything that you buy with US dollars cost more because you're using more US dollars to buy the same thing, whether that's wheat, gold, a house. It'll just make the value of the money worth less. But in all of this video, here's the very, very important part. You know how I always tell you guys that everything's connected. This is a perfect example of that. And you might say, why is Peter talking about this topic and not understand it? But you need to be introduced to it because later it's going to maybe be related to something else. So for example, I'll just get into it here. Here's what's happened. So India has put a ban on non-basmati rice exports. Hold that thought. There's a lot of inflation in India. We're going to talk about that in a second. But first, connected to that, you guys probably remember that the Black Sea was open to Ukrainian ships for wheat, humanitarian aid. Russia promised not to blockade or shoot down or sink any of the Ukrainian ships. They have recently reversed, and you probably heard this in the news about how Russia says we're not going to abide by that arrangement anymore. And so now the Ukrainian ships are not safely passing over the Black Sea. So they're not going. They're staying in port. We're going to get into that in a second too. So bear with me here. This is from the European Council. 40% of the World Food Programme's wheat supplies come from Ukraine. And they send those commodities to Yemen, Afghanistan, Djibouti, Sudan, Kenya, Somalia. A lot of countries that are just developing nations and they need that food. And keep this all in mind too, that what else is connected to it is the insane weather we're having. It was recently the hottest day ever recorded on the earth. So you might have not been too hot where you were, but if you average out everywhere on the earth has never been hotter. This was a few days ago. A few days before that, it was the hottest day. Then it broke the record. So there's a lot of wildfires. There's a lot of crops dying. There's not a lot of water to water the crops. And besides wheat, a ton of potash comes out of Ukraine. Potash is fertilizer. You need it to help your crops grow better. So that's also been affected. But going back to the European Council, what else they said was, according to Ukraine's Ministry for Agriculture, due to the Russian war on that country, approximately 22 million tons of grain are stranded in Ukraine waiting for export. Meanwhile, there's entire nations of starving people a matter of a few thousand miles away. There's always enough food. There's enough food for the entire world if you just look at what's growing in Canada alone. It's about logistics. How do you get the food to the people who need it in Ethiopia? But to continue with this European Council article, the broad implications are clear. Ukraine supplies up to 16% of the world's corn exports and more than 40% of the world's sunflower oil. A recent BBC report noted that Egypt and Bangladesh each get about 1/4 of their wheat from Ukraine. Moldova, already suffering from Russian occupation and the war's fallout, gets over 90% of its wheat from Ukraine. So that's the setup. And then at the same time as all of this that I've just talked about, the Indian nation has put a ban on exports of non-basmati rice. It's a type of rice, the longer multicolored rice that is used in a lot of Indian cooking. Not the white rice that you see, Uncle Ben's converted rice. But there's a lot of follow-on effects from this. For example, people might start stockpiling rice, just like they did with toilet paper. But we do produce enough rice in America that we don't have to worry that much about the rice ban. Who's got to worry about it is all these nations I'm talking about that rely on India for a lot of their food. And also, other countries are going to react to India's move. India did it because they had 4.3% inflation annualized. And in the latest reading, it actually went up 1% month over month. The move was designed to help lower rice prices and secure availability in India, according to the government statement. And so other countries might also react to this, where they say, well, we're not going to be getting enough food from India. We'll have to put bans on other exports that we have. And this is all going to cause inflation in all of these other nations, maybe not India, but it's an inflationary force on Bangladesh, Malaysia, Pakistan. As of and effective immediately on July 20th, India stopped exporting any non-basmati rice. The ban, following other restrictions, has sent the Asian market into a panic, said Tanner Emke, lead economist for grains and oilseeds at CoBank. Now there's concern about food inflation, especially across Asia. India is responsible for about 40% of the global rice trade, he noted. The banned items amount to about 15%. So among other countries that I mentioned that were affected by this, there's also Vietnam, the Philippines, in Africa is the Ivory Coast, Nigeria, Senegal. And this is from ABC News. India's rice export ban, the war in Ukraine, and El Nino create a bleak outlook for the world's starving millions. This video is dedicated to all the people in the Peter Leeds Army. We love you guys. We do everything we do for you guys and because of you guys. If you haven't joined the Army yet, please consider doing it at peterleeds.com/army. It really helps us out. It gives us a lot of power to do more analysis, research, and get you the information that you need to hear.